All right, ready for this. Today's deep dive might sound a little dry, kind of like watching paint dry based on the title. We're digging into lies, damned lies, and drug war statistics. But trust me on this, it's way more interesting than it sounds. It's not just about numbers.
What really got me about this book was how the authors, Matthew Robinson and Renee Sherlin, they go about this whole thing. Instead of just diving headfirst into spreadsheets, they zoom out first. They look at the big picture, the whole ideology behind this war on drugs thing, and how that, ends up shaping how data gets presented.
Okay, so what are they getting at? Are they saying that the Office of National Drug Control Policy, the ONDCP, is being purposely misleading, like straight up lying?
Not necessarily, not directly. It's more like, well, think of any government agency, right? The ONDCP, they're going to want to show that what they're doing is working. That influences how they decide to present the data they have.
Makes sense, right? Like, we all want to put our best foot forward.
Totally. But the book, it's saying there's more to it than just spinning things positive, It's about shaping the whole story, the narrative around the drug war.
Uh-huh.
And they have this really interesting example. You remember the Just Say No campaign?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Back in the 80s, the big slogan, the PSAs, all that.
Exactly. So the book breaks it all down, how the ONDCP basically took credit for this decline in drug use that was already happening. It had already started before Just Say No was even a thing. They even point to the specific stats that were used to try and back it up.
So they were, trying to take credit for something that was already going to happen anyway? That's some pretty strategic use of data there?
It really makes you think twice about the whole story they were trying to sell. This claims-making idea, that's what the authors call it. And it's kind of a big deal throughout the whole book. It's all about how the ONDCP goes about creating this narrative around the drug war and how, data is basically a tool to support that.
Okay, so it's less about the numbers themselves and more about how those numbers get, spun, the context they're presented in.
Yeah, exactly. And a lot of times, that context, it leaves some important stuff out. Things like societal factors that might be playing into drug use or what these drug policies actually cost. It's selective storytelling, basically.
Which, if you're trying to justify a whole war on something, that kind of makes sense, I guess. Nobody wants to hear about all the downsides to their big plan.
And this leads to what I think is maybe the most interesting part of the whole thing.
Yeah.
The data itself. Where does the ONDCP actually get all this information? And are the sources as reliable as they want us to believe?
Oh, okay. So now it's we're peeling back the layers of the onion here. What kind of sources are we even talking about?
Well, a lot of the sources are ones you've probably heard of before. Things like the National Household Survey on Drug Abuse. That's a biggie. They also look at monitoring the future. You're familiar with that one? It's all about surveying students about drug use. And get this, even things like how much drugs cost on the street. They have to get that info from somewhere.
Yeah, that always kind of makes me wonder, how do they even figure that out? You'd almost have to have someone on the inside, right? Undercover or something.
Right. The book actually digs into how researchers even try to figure out these, street prices. And the big takeaway is, it's not exactly, an exact science.
Yeah.
But the ONDCP, they often present those numbers as if there's no question about them.
So we're already seeing that pattern here, right? Like we talked about before, it's not just about the raw numbers, but about how they get, framed for us. Mm. How else did Robinson and Sherlin, what other issues did they find with the ONDCP sources?
So remember earlier how we were talking about the ONDCP, taking credit for that decline in drug use that had already started? Well, get this, right in the middle of the period they were looking at, so 1989 to 1998, they made a pretty major change to how they actually collect the data.
Whoa, hold up, seriously. They changed the rules of the game in the middle of the game.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
So before 1999, that big National Household Survey on drug abuse, it was all old school, pen and paper, the old-fashioned way. But then they switched over to doing computer-assisted interviews. And then on top of that, in 2002, they made even more changes to the whole survey.
Okay, so I'm not a statistician or anything, but that seems kind of fishy, if you're trying to track something over time, wouldn't you want to keep things consistent? So you're comparing apples to apples?
You'd think, right. And that's their point exactly. I mean, it becomes near impossible to do accurate comparisons over the long term when you're constantly tweaking how you're gathering the information.
Yeah. It's like they're moving the goalposts so they can score an easy point. So are they implying that the ONDCP made all these changes just to, hide something? Maybe the data they were getting before wasn't really telling the story they wanted to tell?
That's a question they definitely raise.
Mm-hmm.
But they don't really give any definite answers. They're just putting it out there, the timing of it all. kind of up to the reader to decide what to make of it all.
Okay, so we've got some potential, shall we say, data massaging happening, some claims that are a little iffy. But the big question here is, like, does any of it even work? Is the war on drugs, at least according to what the ONDCP is putting out there, is it actually getting them what they want?
Well, that is the million-dollar question, isn't it? And that's exactly what Robinson and Sherlin, that's what they wanted to find out. A good chunk of the book is dedicated to really diving into how effective the war on drugs has been. And let's just say the results are pretty revealing.
All right, lay it on me. Is it working or not?
Well, to answer that, we got to look at what the ONDCP's actual goals were, right? Like, what are they even trying to accomplish with all this?
Okay, so what are we talking about? Just like less drug use overall, fewer people getting hooked, putting those cartels out of business. What's the big measure of success here?
All of the above. It's a whole multi-pronged approach. You know, they obviously want to see less drug use. That's a given. But they also want to keep new users from even starting and, you know, disrupt the drug markets, make it harder for people to even get their hands on this stuff in the first place. So Robinson and Sherlin, they go through each one of these goals, and then they hold it up next to the data, looking for any actual, you know, hard evidence of success.
Okay, so it's like they're holding the ONDCP accountable for its own homework. So what'd they find? Give it to me straight, the good, the bad, and the ugly.
Well, if we're talking about reducing drug use, I mean, that's the big kahuna, right? Like, less people using drugs is what the ONDCP wants to see.
Yeah, makes sense. So did they actually manage to, like, make a dent in drug use?
That's where things get a little, well, interesting. The ONDCP, they definitely weren't short on claiming victories, you know. But then when Robinson and Sherlin, when they really dug into the data, what they found was that for a good chunk of the 90s, drug use actually went up.
Wait, hold on. They're out here claiming victory in the war on drugs, but the numbers show that more people are actually using drugs.
Pretty much. And it wasn't just some, you know, tiny blip on the radar either. We're talking marijuana, cocaine, heroin, even things like inhalants, especially with younger kids. It was like across the board.
Wow, okay. So much for reducing drug use. What about stopping people from ever starting? Do they have any luck there?
They saw some short-term dips with certain groups, but again, the overall trend, not so good. Like, they looked at high schoolers, and those guys were consistently saying that in 98, it was just as easy to get drugs as it was in 89, if not easier.
So much for just say no, huh? It's like they're trying to put out a forest fire with, like, I don't know, a squirt gun. Okay, so what about this whole disrupting the drug market angle? I mean, all that money they were pouring into law enforcement, that had to count for something, right?
That's what you'd think, right?
Yeah.
But the data tells a different story. So get this. Despite everything they were doing to try and crack down on trafficking, the price of drugs actually went down a lot of the time. And there was never any shortage of supply either.
So cheaper and easier to get. That's not exactly a glowing review of their whole strategy.
Right. It kind of makes you think twice about just focusing on the supply side of things, you know. If nobody's dealing with the demand, the market's going to find a way.
Okay, so if we're keeping score here, it sounds like the ONDCP is, what, 0 for 3 on their own goals?
There might even be putting it nicely. Robinson and Sherlin, they pretty much flat out say that based on the ONDCP's own data, the war on drugs, at least back then, was a straight up failure. And an expensive one at that.
Because, yeah, all of this comes with a pretty hefty price tag, right?
No kidding. And that's another thing they hit on hard. This huge financial burden of the whole drug war thing. The costs just keep going up, putting people in jail, the strain on cops and the courts. It really adds up.
And for what? If drug use is up and nobody's having trouble getting their hands on anything, what are we even getting out of all this spending?
Good question, right? And it's not like the ONDCP is jumping at the chance to answer it either. In fact, the book points out how they almost never really talk about what this is all costing us.
So they're potentially, you know, fudging the numbers a bit, making claims that are kind of iffy, and then not even being honest about what it's costing us. That's pretty bad. So where does that leave us? What are we supposed to do with all this information?
I think it's a wake-up call. You know, don't just accept what you're told, especially when it comes from people who have a vested interest in keeping things exactly as they are.
So we all need to become statisticians in our spare time. Start digging through government reports and stuff.
No, not exactly. But we do have to get better at, you know, thinking critically about the information we're being bombarded with every day. Question things. Look at the context. And be really skeptical when something seems too good to be true or maybe even too convenient.
And think for yourself, basically.
Yeah, and be open to different points of view. One of the things that surprised me the most was that the book, it doesn't really talk about what would happen if We treated drug use like a health problem instead of something criminal.
Interesting. So, like, focusing on treatment and prevention instead of punishment. What if, instead of another SWAT team, we invested in rehab centers and mental health resources?
It's a big shift, for sure, but it's something to think about. And that's what I like about this book. It doesn't just criticize, how things are. It makes you think about different ways to approach the whole thing.
It's less about having all the answers and more about, like, asking the right questions in the first place. We need to look past the headlines and really have a more, nuanced conversation about drug policy.
Exactly. And that's a conversation we all need to be a part of.
Well said. Well, there you have it, folks. The ONDCP. Really good at spin, maybe not so much at getting results. If you want to learn more about this whole thing, and I think you should, check out Lies, Damned Lies, and Drug War Statistics. It's a bit of a dense read, I'll be honest, but it will really make you think. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep asking those tough questions.